So my name is Barbe Chambliss. This is who I am. It may be a little hard. Well, rather than telling you my age, I'll tell you that I've lived in Carbondale, and actually was Lori Loeb and I were two of the first people that got the Chautauqua grant to start the mountain fair. So that's pretty ancient when you think about it. Definitely puts me in that upper group that we're all
in.
that we're all in. Yeah. And I have to say, another thankful thing I am is, Larry, I'm thankful for the unique way a person over 60 has figured out how to do the tech part of this presentation. It's really unique. I mean, it's very similar to the women peacemakers that I interviewed. They didn't have any money, so they had to source their money. This is pretty darn creative, let me just say that. So thank you for that.
Welcome.
The topic, I guess, of this morning would be peacemaking. And let me just start from the very beginning by telling you a definition of peacemaking that I had to develop in the process of getting a PhD in the subject and writing a book in the subject. So you can do this with me. If you'll put your hands out here like someone was going to fill their hands with cold, clear water. And this represents peace because these hands are equal. It represents equal respect. If you raise one hand and lower the other, it is not peace because you've got a dominant and a subordinate element. And so peacemaking to me is when somebody makes this happen. When they are working to make equal respect happen between entities. And an entity can be another person, it can be another culture, it can be voiceless things like a river, water, or an animal, or something like that. So I had to simplify what peace meant. And then I can go further this morning and say, well, why? Why is mutual respect something that leads to peacemaking? And an answer to that was so beautifully given by one of the women that I talked to about this, and she said this: when peace is made, it is a synonym for respect. The main point is that when people respect each other, and this next part really took me months to really grok. When people respect each other, they're willing to share power. Sharing power is the opposite of using military power, of occupation or oppression. So that's how something this simple actually translates into equal respect and behavior that is trying to approach this in life. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my history, for a couple of minutes about my history. Ever since I was little, I've always wanted to know how peace was made. And I had some stuff happen to me in Appalachia when I was a little kid, like 6. And it was traumatic enough that I totally forgot it, didn't remember it until I was in my 40s. But I think at that time, the seed for trying to find out how peace is made got planted. And then I had a great childhood in Denver. I grew up in pretty privileged, I would say. And then I went to college. And when I got out of college, all of my male compatriots were up for the draft. And when they went to boot camp and then would come home just briefly before they were shipped off to Vietnam, they could definitely tell me how war was made. They'd spent all that time in boot camp learning it in detail. And I kept wanting at that time to go like, well, wait a minute. So how can we balance that out by saying, how is peace made? And I didn't know. So this search for how peace is actually made has been a long one for me. When I guess I'll leap to when I was going to graduate school. I picked peacemaking as a topic that I wanted to study. and I didn't quite know how. I was sort of in a field of semi-consciousness. I kind of knew it, kind of seemed interesting. I just wasn't very focused on the whole thing, but it seemed like a good topic. It's one that hadn't been very researched before, and so I went to a graduate school, the Fielding Graduate Institute, where it was both online at that time, no Zoom, but we got to know each other intimately through our papers and through our things. And then twice a year we would meet on either coast to catch the European students and the Asian students. And I picked one of the mandates for a PhD is that you need to fill a hole in the literature. And there was plenty of information about Nelson Mandela and about Martin Luther King and about several other peacemakers, but most of them were male peacemakers. So I couldn't find in the literature very much about the females. So I thought, well, I'll just pick women peacemakers. I actually tried to go to study the Nobel Peace Prize women, but they either weren't available, they were in house arrest, or they weren't doing their peacemaking work anymore. They were just talking about it. So I said, well, wait a minute. Why don't I pick everyday, normal people? Because what I really want is to help everyday, normal people figure out how to go about making peace. So I chose women peacemakers. Sometimes it's come back to bite me because when men see that, I've ended up with a book, and the book's title, as you see, is Women Peacemakers. And a lot of men will write off the book, like it's feminism, it's all about women. It's not about feminism. It's about a form of peacemaking that I discovered by interviewing, at that time, 14 women all over the world. Mm-hmm. Currently 60. I've now interviewed about 60 women. And so I decided this was all still sort of a playful academic exercise for me. I thought, you know what? I'm going to interview women all over the world that do this. And then I kind of went like, yeah, how the heck are you going to pay for this? So at the Graduate Institute where I went, they let me put my tuition on a credit card, and I put it on a mileage plus card. Mm-hmm. And when I got enough miles, I would go visit one of these women. So for an example, in Glenwood Springs one time there was a community concert of 5 Irish brothers. And it was a pretty good concert, but afterwards I went backstage and I said to them, I am looking for women peacemakers to interview. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, if this is peace and this is not, do you know anybody that is making this happen? And they said, oh, we know nothing about this, he said. But our sister Fanula, she's a disc jockey in Belfast. Oh, no, in Dublin. And he said, here's her phone number. And that was the beginning for me. So I called up this disc jockey sister, and she said, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. She said, I got 2 names for you. One was Bernadette Devlin, and I don't know how many people might even remember that. She was well known. She was the youngest member of Parliament. She was from Ireland, which was really unique. And the other one was a woman named Sister Sarah Clark. So I packed up my 9-year-old son, and we went to London, which is where Sister Sarah was living, and we started interviewing. So I'm gonna, and so all of this was leading toward definitely a dissertation, but I'm trying to figure out whether to talk about the book first or about how the whole, let me just keep on this track. So I finished the dissertation, and the title of it was Women Peacemakers, the Hidden Side of Peacemaking. Because whereas protesters are anything but hidden, they're one part of the village that we need to make peace. They're really important. But they're loud, they speak from their personal experience, they're en masse, and that's the opposite of what happened when I started interviewing these women. These women are alone, very quiet. Often in the beginning of their work, they're very marginalized. And they just are driven by a sense of seeing something that doesn't feel fair, doesn't feel just, doesn't feel right. and they go like, I think I'll just do something about that. And they all start tiny, small. And then every day, these women would get up and say, do I want to keep doing this work? Like, it's dangerous, or I'm exhausted, or I'm out of money, or things like this. And then they would just say, yep, I'm going to keep doing this. And as you'll see, when the stories in the book come out, some of them turned into things that actually changed whole cultures, whole ways of educating children, whole ways of looking at people with disabilities. And some of them stayed pretty little tiny because they would check and say, do I want to go big with this? Or do I just want to stay focused on a few small? Both of which were legitimate choices, but it just goes to show you that peacemaking, you don't have to be Mother Teresa. It's not rocket science. It has to do with your heart, your intuition. It's your sense of like, just doesn't feel right, just doesn't feel just. So long story short, I'm gonna go back now and just talk to you about. I have now put 15 of those stories into a book. It's this yellow book, and it's called Women Peacemakers: What We Can Learn from Them. And I want to talk for just a minute about the outside of the book and the inside of the book. This is one of the most beautifully packaged books you'll ever see, and it has to do with a woman from Carbondale here, Elisa Onmacht, who was the Sopra Sun lady for a long time, taught at Marble School. Elisa's a graphic artist, and among other things, to work with her, she was a peacemaker in how she worked with me. Because if you see this is peace and this is not, there are lots of ways to make this happen. One is that you can take this and you can go like that. But that's what war is, okay? Because it never goes like this. It goes like this. Or you can say, oh, I want to bring this party up, and I'll do it this way. And that's not the work of these women. They don't do things for people. They do things with people. And they don't even do this. They do this. They do it together. And that's how Elisa worked with me. And one of the fascinating things that she did, she said to me, I know that you've got all these chapters that you've written, and I know you've asked each woman to give you a photograph. And the way you presented the draft to me is you wanted the women, the picture of the women to be at the head of each chapter. She said, here's a budget that'll tell you how much that book would cost. And she said, be prepared, because if you put one colored page inside of a book, you have to print the entire book on color quality. And she gave me the budget, and I went like, ooh, ouch. So she said, why don't we put, your cover's going to be colored anyway. Why don't we put all the women's pictures on this cover? And then she said, why don't we put out for bid, let's see how we can do this. She said, let's put out for bid to ask people if they could take these pictures and make black and white sketches from them. And we put it out electronically. We put it out, and we got 43 people that wanted to do it. And we ended up with, let me just show you a couple of these. I think they're mind-blowing. I think they're really beautiful. Here is the picture that got made of the first woman.
Wow. That is beautiful.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And here is the clan mother. Let's see.
Wow.
And then somebody came to me the other day that had read the book and said, this book just flows so beautifully. It's a dense book. You won't sit down and read this like you will a novel. But it does flow. The print flows, the way it's organized flows, and this is Elisa's gift to this book. So now the inside of the book. I chose, it was agonizing to choose 15 women out of the 60 that I've interviewed. But I chose women that represent a breadth of geographical area, a breadth of age. Four of the women died before the book came out. Um, and also were really good examples of ordinary women creating extraordinary acts of peacemaking as a way to hopefully focus on other people. This may be Rita. Yeah, good. So, about halfway through, chapter 3 in this book is about a woman by the name of Judith Genya. And one day I went out to me, I got the women's names. I got women nominated to me all over the place for interviews, way more than I could ever interview. And one of my criteria for the dissertation was the woman had to be nominated by herself, by someone else, and by herself. And trying to get the women to admit that they were peacemakers was the most difficult part of this whole task. I would call them up. I got something in my mailbox one day that said, "This sounds like a peacemaker to me." It was from the magazine from United Airlines. Somebody had traveled on it and then mailed me this piece of this article that was there. So I called her up in Rio de Janeiro and I said, "I'm doing a dissertation on peacemaking. Would you allow me to come interview you?" And she said, like all the other women said, "I would love to have you interview me, but I don't think I'm a peacemaker." So this left me in violation of the criteria for my dissertation. So my high school son said, "Mom, look, ask them their definition of peace, and then ask them if they do anything to make that happen." And it was really magical for me once I got afraid of doing this. I would say that, and they'd go like, "Oh yeah, I do those things." And I would say, "Well, just saying, that kind of makes you a peacemaker." And then I would wait and watch their face. And it was really lovely to watch them. There was only one woman after all this introductory part happened that said, "I'm not a peacemaker." So in the very beginning of this book, one of the things you'll find about 3 pages in is this. It says there's peacemaking and there's conscious peacemaking. This book is about the latter. So that process I did with the women actually shifted 60 women. There were 2 of them that came out of the chute saying they were peacemakers, but the rest of them, they were willing to do that transition piece right there. And that's actually what I'm hoping to do with this whole book, is to wake up as many conscious peacemakers as possible in today. For a while, that was an academic exercise. But chapter 3 in this book, somebody sent me a funding request for a woman named Judith Genya. And it was a request to donate to a camp that she was putting on for Bosnian refugee kids. Or not even refugee kids, but Bosnian kids that had lived through the 4 years of the Bosnian War. So I called Judith up and I said, "Judith, I'm really fascinated by this camp that you're going to have." And I said, "I don't have much money. Can I volunteer?" And she said, "Yeah, that's exactly what this is about." So I said, "Well, I kind of envisioned," I said, "a camp for Bosnian refugee kids, like maybe I could go be a cook in a camp in Los Angeles or something like that." She said, "I signed you up." And I said, "Okay, great. What do I do?" She said, "Well, you owe me $450. If I had just given her $100, I would have missed the opportunity, but I would have been much richer." She said, I think it's $450 for you to come, and then you owe me another $450 for a kid to come to the camp. I said, "Wow, where's the camp?" She said, "In Croatia, because it's the only safe place we could find to hold a camp where these kids could feel safe just for 2 weeks." So Nancy Kiner and I actually both signed up for it and went over there with 60 pounds of stuff, swimming trunks, toys, soap, anything that we could help run the music. And after the 2 weeks of the camp, and the kids said to us, we changed our airplane reservations. The kids said to us, would you please come home with us? Because we don't think anybody knew this war was going on. Because if they knew, why did it go on for 4 years? And we said, yes, we'll come home. And then they said, would you tell people what you see when you go home? So we went to Sarajevo and we went to a town called Tuzla. And the book will tell you what happened to me in that, but the gist of it is, it's the closest as an American woman I could ever get to war without being endangered myself. But it shook the dickens out of me. And I came home and I said, this cannot just be an academic exercise. I have to do something about this. I have to do something about keeping things like this from happening again, about proactively creating situations where people don't do this to each other. They don't do this. And in the long run, I said, yeah, and not just me. I need to do what I can to wake up the peacemaker in other people. So the first 15 chapters of this book are stories of women all over the world. And I'll tell you the questions they asked in a minute. Well, let me just tell you now. I asked each of them, how did you find your peacemaking work? What led you down this path instead of some other path? How did you stick with the work when it got rough? Some of them were older, and I said, how are you handling the fact that your peacemaking work is still needed and you're getting older? I asked each of them, what is your definition of peace, and what are you doing to bring that about? I asked them, what role do you think forgiveness plays in peacemaking? I asked them, could you tell me a metaphor for yourself as a peacemaker? I asked them, if you could paint a picture of your definition of peace happening in the world right now, what would that picture look like? Tell me with your words. Paint that picture with your words. And then I asked them, what advice would you give someone that wanted to become a peacemaker? And that last question I asked actually is chapter 16 of this book. It's the verbatim answers they give to advice to anybody that wants to be a peacemaker. In chapter 17 of the book, I began to realize that these women never knew each other. They've never heard of each other for the most part. I'm hoping someday to have a party for them. Both the souls that have passed and the ones that are still here, so they can meet each other. But as I read their transcripts over and over and over again from the interviews, I saw these threads of things that they all sort of shared doing. And I'm going to go over some of those threads this morning. And so chapter 17 is 24 bullet points of commonalities that these women used in their practices of peacemaking. And then chapter 18 in this book is an invitation for the reader or the listener. I also have had time to record the book, so it could be a listener or a reader, to do an act of peacemaking and to write up the story of it, how it affected them, how it affected whoever they were working with, and then send it to me. And I'm going to be collecting more and more of these peacemaking stories. And as I've done some audience talks over time about this, I would say to the audience, turn to someone next to you, whether you know them or not. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to sort of exchange emails so you can be accountability partners for this. And then start thinking about what kind of acts of peacemaking you might do. And then stay in touch with each other about how it's going, or how to stretch your ideas about how to find the peacemaking work. And I've never, ever known if that worked. So I think if people can send a story back to me, I'll know. And that's a selfish thing on my part, but I would love to know that there are more and more everyday peacemakers that are finding their way to doing acts of peacemaking. Now, what's really interesting about that is every day, everybody's doing acts of peacemaking all over the place. I mean, if you see somebody that needs help across the street and you help them, that actually is an act of doing something like this. But because the book says this is a book about conscious peacemaking, I want to talk for just a second about the difference between spontaneous peacemaking and conscious peacemaking. So, in the course of my studies, I studied with a woman named Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. And she was telling a story about herself one day, and Clarissa was a force to be reckoned with. She probably weighed 250 or something like that. She said she was in the grocery store one day, and in the next aisle, she heard a mom escalating with a kid. And she could feel that the mom was getting real close to smacking the kid. So she just takes her cart and she goes down to the aisle and turns around and comes down in their aisle, and she goes up to the mother and she hugged the mom. She said, "Wow, sounds like you're having a rough day. I get it. I've had kids this age too." She picks the kid up out of the woman's cart and said, "Your little tyke and I are going to go take a little walk in the store. We'll meet you at the butter aisle in 5 minutes. See you later." And she just wheels her cart back down the other way. That's a spontaneous act of peacemaking. It's brilliant, but it's not sustainable. It doesn't say to this world that has so many messages about how war is made, how domination is done. It doesn't say, "Hey, look, here is an act of peacemaking. Let's have bigger conversations about these kinds of acts." So the difference between what Clarissa did and what I would really encourage people to do is to mindfully choose a project, and I'll go through it a little bit with you, to get up every day like these women did and say, "Do I want to keep doing this?" And going like, "Yep, I think I do." And then telling somebody about it. That's a way to keep it conscious. Tell someone, write a story of it, ask questions of someone, share something with an accountability partner, something like that. And then be at peace with the mantle of being a peacemaker, because it's so much harder for the peacemaking acts to be heard today than the dominant acting. I mean, the media thrives on tough stories. Stories that, I mean, the media, and by the way, video games, all thrive on stories of dominant, subordinate kinds of stuff. So what I'd like is a culture where people are going like, "Wow, I just heard the coolest thing." And like, I've taught kids in this school system here, 500 parents and kids in this school system, how to be peace place mediators. And it changes the conversation in the classroom. So that is what chapter 18, the last chapter of this book, is about. And it invites the reader or the listener to please do an act of peacemaking. It gives them a little bit of information about how to do that. Hopefully reading the women's stories will spark all sorts of ideas for people. But what I'd like to do this morning, because I think this is a fairly auspicious crowd, I would like to go a little bit deeper into what do I mean by actually do an act of peacemaking. Now, first of all, if I give you just a minute, you probably are already doing some. And so, I don't know how we'll do this here. I can repeat this, but does anybody right now feel like they're engaged in doing some sorts of acts of peacemaking? If you think about this, Larry, I'll repeat it. So, well, let's see. There you go.
What would you like, Barb? You want a story or?
I would like anything you want to say about your authorship or participation in an act of peacemaking. Something that you may never have said before, but it's about to climb the ladder into consciousness for all of us.
Well, I've been a member of this group for 6 years, something like that. And Rita first brought me into the fold and introduced me to Golden, and Golden gave me an opportunity to speak in this room for the first time. I've done so a number of times since, and I'm kind of making this up as I go along, but the work that I do is a development of an understanding of who we are and why we're here and why people do what they do, and the sort of ego soup that we all swim in, and how to recognize that, and how to bring it to conscious awareness, and how to find our authenticity in surrounding that soup that we spend much of our lives in. And for me, that's active peacemaking. It has to do with not only respect for one another and oneself, but a recognition that we're not separate. And that there's really one being expressed as all these individual humannesses. And this is the most wonderful time of my life, getting to do that and getting it, as I said, treading this solitary path with all of you.
So there are really three cool things about what you said, Larry. One is, well, let's just keep it right on you. One is, I'm making this up as I go along. Well, the truth is, it's coming into consciousness as you go along. Second of all, you said that you are having really, this is the best time of your life. That actually happens with peacemaking. Sometimes it's the hardest time of your life, but in retrospect, all of these women felt like making a difference in the world was the best contribution they could do with their lives. And I will say, during this COVID period, working with these women's transcripts has kept me uplifted during the whole time. And then the third thing that you said was a kind of peacemaking that's often not recognized is what you're doing, which is to introduce people to an awareness of a topic, and that might broaden who they are, bring them into their own potential. There's a chapter in this book about a woman named Theo Colborn, and I don't know if anybody knows her. She's from Paonia, and she is an endocrinologist. And she introduced us to the whole idea that petroleum products are ruining our future, because when a pregnant woman comes into contact with a certain kind of plastics, you want me to do it to me?
Yeah, I'll let you do it. I want you on the camera.
Okay, so Theo took an area of ignorance, sort of like you are finding, like, how can we show more about what's going on even though it's not visible? And she, through her research, she proved that when you come in contact with petroleum products, and if you're pregnant, you change the force of history because of what happens to the fetus interacting with the petroleum products. Nobody knew about this. There wasn't even a field of science at the time. But we were ignorant and didn't know it, and her information brought us into peacemaking. And I tried in each of these chapters to say, this is what's happened because of this woman's work. And I mean, a gynecologist right now, or an OBGYN will say to a woman, be really careful about this and this and this, and here's why. And here's the science behind it. So I see you doing something similar, filling in making conscious some areas of knowledge that make us see our potential more. Anyone else here that's doing it? Or yeah, okay, John?
So, I want to start somewhere that puts it in context. So when my future wife Kelly and I met in Seattle, we had both been through really difficult marriages, two each. And when we came together, there was just some synergy that took place, some amalgamation of each of our individual difficult experiences, and came together. And what emerged was this amazing relationship of peace and kindness and respect and all of this. And it felt spontaneous. And over a period of time, several friends, when they'd see the way we were living together in our lives and said, you guys should teach this because you're living it. So in the ensuing years, we've put together some workshops and we've done some retreats. And the theme basically was wildly thriving relationships. Initially was about either couples or people that were single at the time and wanted to be in a harmonious relationship. And it's all about being at peace with yourself and with each other and, by extension, the community. And so it's been wonderfully. We've lost tremendous amounts of money in doing these. But everyone that we've done, we've had people that have just come to us and just expressed how grateful they were for that opportunity, because it's experiential. It's not us talking at people, but it's creating experiences for people to experience the peace of themselves and with each other. And so the satisfaction, we would do it all over again, and we're going to continue to do it as things evolve. But just the joy of having people, wake up in little ways here and there and seeing them pop. It's just beyond amazing. So
Perfect. So how does it feel having stated it to this audience?
feels great.
Okay.
Because at first, when you first, put out the invitation just now, I was like, I'm not doing anything. Really? And then all of a sudden, oh, there's this.
Yeah.
So yeah, because I'm a random acts of peace kind of a person. Whenever it shows up, I do it, and that's not the criteria you're looking for. And then suddenly it's like, oh, but I also do this. So it feels good. It feels really good and empowering, and it's informing. This right here is informing a future path.
Great.
Just being able to express this. So thank you.
How about one more story from anybody? Donna?
Yeah, I consciously, throughout my day, will make contact with the people that I encounter by eye contact, orally, or hand gesture. Whether that's a guy on the side of on the corner with a sign, or some of the people that I work with that have different racial backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and I let them know that I'm benign in some sense, and I recognize that there's in the collective an element of hostility towards some of these groups, and I just want them to know that I'm with them, and that I come in peace.
Great. So I'm just going to tell you a brief story about one of the women in the book. She's from Rio de Janeiro. She works with the favela kids, the shantytown kids. And these kids are all descendants of the black slaves that were brought over to Brazil to work. And these kids don't even know that they exist. They are who the drug dealers use to deliver the drugs. And if they botch a job, they just shoot them right in the streets. And so she said one of her things is to teach these kids that they exist. I'm just going to read a little bit here very quickly for you. It's very much what you're doing, Don, I have to say. Let's see. Naively, I thought that Yvonne, this white revolutionary, which was her metaphor for herself, must teach these children to read and write as one might do in a traditional school. But there's absolutely nothing traditional about how Yvonne transfers information to these children. She intuitively identifies what each child needs on a moment-by-moment basis. She told me that her first objective is to teach them that they exist. This phrase brought me up short and has haunted me ever since she said it. What's it like not to know that you exist? How did I learn that I existed? Yvonne is clear about her plan for teaching these children that they exist. So the first thing she does is the reading primer for these kids, she puts a kid on her lap and she reads the children's code, who nobody ever pays attention to. But these are the laws in Brazil about keeping children safe. She says this is very important because if they know the mechanics and the laws, they will know for the first time when a law is being broken. She tells the children to straighten up their homes and make the streets they live on safe for others to walk on. Perhaps one of Yvonne's most poignant ways of teaching existence is to take a child by the hand, stand out in the street, look up at the sky and say, I am someone. It strikes me, Don, that that's actually what you're doing by making eye contact with somebody on the street who probably feels pretty down in the situation. Recognizing them just with your eyes as a human, or maybe your voice, as being another fellow human. It's really quite lovely, and you'll find it, I think, repeated in here. So what I'd like to do for the last minute or two here is just read you a few of these bullet points in chapter 17 about how these women go about doing their work. Number 1 is be awake when the opportunity presents itself. It's pretty amazing how often we aren't. I'll tell you a really brief story about my own conscious, subconscious, conscious trip. I used to be so angry about Donald Trump that I would have all this chemistry going on inside of me about anger. And I didn't like that, and I didn't like how it interrupted anything else I was doing. So I made a goal of reading, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it's Kuan Yin's Prayer for the Abuser. Kuan Yin is the female Buddha, right? And she's written this really amazing prayer for the abuser. And it would calm me down, and it would take me away from being angry at one person's unacceptable behavior. And after about 2 years of doing this, I didn't have to read that anymore. So I had to consciously pull out that prayer, read that prayer until actually I could flip my chemistry just by remembering having read that prayer. And that to me, and I would notice it, I had to say, oh yeah, I can feel everything calming down. I don't hate this guy. I hate his behavior, but I don't hate the guy. And so that I had to consciously do something, and then it became myelinated in my brain. And so the pathway to calming down, getting out of blame was so well established by that time that I didn't need the prayer. So it actually went from subconscious anger to conscious changing it into a subconscious habit that I don't need a reminder for today. So my guess is this isn't the first time you've looked at somebody on the street. You've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, I have.
Okay. All right, just briefly, then I'll open it up for some questions. Be awake when the opportunity presents itself. And this second one is important. Develop your service in response to people's expressed sense of need. When listening for this, be sure you're listening to understand their needs rather than listening to validate your preconceived idea of what is needed. That's so you can do this.
Could you be willing to read that again?
Mm-hmm. Develop your service in response to people's expressed sense of need. When listening for this, be sure that you're listening to understand their needs rather than listening to validate your preconceived idea of what is needed. Number 3 is never lose sight of your goal and never get attached to how you get there. This is probably if I had to pick out one out of all these things, this is one of the most useful things. Number 5 is every day revisit the wisdom of and your willingness to continue this work. If you need money to do your work, be creative about sourcing it. If you read these chapters about how did they finance these things, it's as creative as Larry's way of doing the technology here. Work with and not for. Work alongside those who request your services. Another one is pace yourself. Make a little peace, make a little dinner. Know that your work might not be completed in your lifetime. Practice patience and persistence and employ them both simultaneously. That's pretty tricky. Sometimes anger works as a good motivator, but it's an unwise and a dangerous plan of action. Do not use violence of any kind, including to yourself. Pray. When overwhelmed by what you can't do, refocus on what you can do and then proceed with the next right thing. So that's just some of the guidelines these I discovered with these women's work. So I guess the question I leave you with, well, I'll do that at the end. Let me answer any questions you might have of me. Or I don't know if you can take them from the Zoom or.
We can take them from Zoom if people unmute themselves.
Do you have any video of this kind of a presentation that we could refer people to besides what we're doing here today?
Yes. On the back of the book or somewhere, you've put it in your newsletter, is my website. And I have to tell you, I'm about as talented at technology as I am at doing a website, but this website is fantastic. It's been gifted to me. And it's called barbechamblisauthor.com. And as you go to it, it not only tells you how to order the book and the audio book and things like this, but if you go to one place called Media Kit, it's the last option at the top. You actually see several videos of me giving this talk. You'll see me interviewing with Amy Haddon Marsh on the radio. So yeah, I think that's a good way to get acquainted with it. And probably the recording of this, with your permission, will be included in that. Any other questions? No?
Barb, it's Lisa Dancing Light, if you can hear
Hi,
me.
Lisa. Yes.
Hi. Congratulations, first of all. I'm so happy for you. This looks marvelous, and I can't wait to get my own copy. I'm curious how you have, I mean, you've shared so much, obviously, how it's affected you, but how has this changed you as you look at your role as a peacekeeper with the work that you do and have done in the past? Because you were instrumental in my life when I was going through a divorce, in keeping peace and allowing for a very smooth transition in my life to open the way. And that has impacted me and stayed with me my whole life. So that was a long time ago. How has that changed you and your perception of your work?
I think, thank you for saying that. I mean, I know that for 40 years, I trained to be a mediator, and then I've done mediations for 4 years. That looks like an act of peacemaking that worked for you. I also have taught lots of children and adults how to be mediators. I've done all those. But I never really saw it as a focused gift I have to the world until I started writing this book. And someone, the Glenwood Post, I don't know, several years ago, wrote an article, and the headline was "Local Peacemaker." And I went like, oh, why did they put that headline there? And I don't do that today. I am willing to stand up in the mantle of peacemaking. So owning it is, I have to say, is one of the things that has changed. And these women have rubbed off on me, Lisa. It's really interesting. I find myself going to peacemaking ways of thinking. I check in with my heart way before I let my head run the things, the show. if fear is trying to drive my bus, I can turn it around really quickly into gratitude driving my bus. So I would say those are some of the ways that I do that. I mean, I realized after doing 40 years of mediation that I could help somebody who was in conflict in the room change a situation that made better, but they didn't necessarily know how to repeat that when they walked out of the room. So that's when I went into teaching mediation. So I had a client come to me and say, it's a young woman, and she said, I want you to, I'm a therapist and a mediator, and she said, I want your help. I hate my dad, and I need help not hating him. And I said, okay, let's start with like how you communicate with him. So we went through the communication stuff, and she said, things don't change, do they? And I said, what are you talking about? She said, this is exactly the same communication skills you taught me as a mediator in 4th grade. And I went like, yeah, you're right. These things don't change. It's the same, motivation and kindness and use of language and things like that for all. So I'm seeing it come back around, I think. So thank you for the question, Lisa.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I just went on your website really quickly and it looks awesome. So congratulations. I'm so happy for you. I can't wait to read
Thank
it.
you. And I know you're writing a book yourself. So,
Yeah.
cheers.
Same wonderful team. So I'm happy to hear of your wonderful accolades of Alyssa.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Best of success. This is very
Okay.
a legacy.
So I will just leave you with this question. And then, because I met Ellen Stapenhorst, who all of you know, I met her when I was just about to interview Sister Sarah Clark in Ireland, who was taking care of the prisoners over there. And she and I become fast friends because she wrote a song that reflected exactly what Sister Sarah Clark was doing. So I will just leave with you this heartfelt request to keep doing the peacemaking acts you're doing, but make them conscious. And keep looking forward. Don't go back to sleep. Keep looking for the next opportunity to do peacemaking, and then talk to each other about it or email me back about it. All the email information's on that media kit on the website. And the website's really fun. It's very interactive. So the question is, will you take that invitation?